Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Neil Thomas. I'm a fellow on Chinese politics here at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis, or CCA for short. And Premier Li Qiang appeared before the NPC to present his first annual government work report, which announced key economic targets and policy priorities for 2024. To discuss what it all means, I am delighted to be joined today by no less than 3 senior fellows at the CCA. In no special order, we have firstly Guonan Ma, who is a CCA senior fellow on the Chinese economy. He's an economic expert with 4 decades of experience in academia, in investment banking, and is a longtime senior economist at the Bank for International Settlements. Second, we have Bert Hoffman, a super sub who has kindly agreed to join us at the last minute in place of Christopher Johnson, who unfortunately had to drop out due to an urgent matter. Bert is a CCA honorary senior fellow on the Chinese economy. He's director of the East Asian Institute at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, and he was previously the World Bank country director for China. Third, we have Jessica Chen Weiss, who is a CCA senior fellow on foreign policy and national security. She is the Michael J. Zak Professor for China and Asia Pacific Studies at Cornell University and served recently as a senior advisor to the US Secretary of State's policy planning staff. And without further ado, let's get started, and I will turn to Guonan to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everybody. The government work report delivered yesterday in Beijing by Premier Li Qiang will be his first debut. And to explore the economic policy message reviewed by the report, it will be useful conceptually to focus on 3 sets of questions: targets, strengths of policy stimulus, and the key areas of the stimulus program. The most important target, of course, is GDP growth of around 5%, which is unchanged from last year's target, and it's broadly in line with market expectation. The government report also provides a host of other supplementary economic and policy targets, such as 3% inflation, 12 million new job creation, 5.5% unemployment rate, an official budget deficit of 3% GDP, and a modest rise in the issuance of local government special bonds, and around 1 trillion RMB of special central government bonds again this year. One thing worth highlighting is that for the first time, the government report will announce a new annual target for cutting energy intensity by 2.5% this year. Here's some of my initial take. I show how much time do I have. My first take is that this year's GDP growth target is the same as last year, but still look quite ambitious in my view, for 2 reasons. First, it will be more difficult to achieve this year's target due to higher base of comparison. And second, this year's market environment could be less favorable, since the initial euphoria of opening up from the lockdown and the pent-up demand might have mostly vanished in my view. So the same GDP growth target, but a harder task to deliver this time. And also, the 3% annual inflation target looks more like a ceiling than a target, because of ongoing deflationary headwinds. I think a 0.5% inflation this year will be a big achievement already. My second take is that Beijing appears to have shunned from a bazooka-like style stimulus. This makes sense, in my view, for 2 reasons. First, Beijing ought to use its limited policy space wisely in the coming years. And second, the Chinese economy has been holding up, in my view, reasonably well in the recent months, in light of the latest decent Lunar New Year activities. The Chinese economy faces multiple challenges, but it's not all just doom and gloom, in my view. However, this points to a very strange mixed or combination of ambitious growth target on the one hand and somewhat underwhelming stimulus on the other. My third take is that on top of the 3% budget deficit, Beijing again plans to issue another 1 trillion RMB special central government bonds, similar to that of last year. What is new this year, though, is that Beijing intends to issue ultra-long special government bonds of some 30-year to 50-year tenors, and pledge to issue these long bonds repeatedly over the next few years. Apparently, the aim is to leverage the still healthy central government balance sheet to assist the cash-strapped local government to deleverage. In my view, these are very positive, since it represents a meaningful and practical step to address the local government debt challenges, rather than simply kicking the can down the road. my fourth, probably hopefully the final take is that the government report highlights some trade-in programs for both consumer durables and for upgrading of old equipment to promote both consumer spending and business investment. This kind of broadly defined cash for clunker type of program, similar to that of the US in 2009, shall provide a more balanced stimulus to both consumption and investment. However, this stimulus effort will be somewhat transitory in my view, because this program by its nature essentially front-load the normal replacement demand for both consumer durable and business equipment. And I will stop there first before I take up other people's time.
Thank you so much, Guonan, for those thoughts. And we'll turn now to Bert for his reactions.
All right, thanks. First of all, I have to correct you, Neil. I'm no longer the director of the East Asian Institute. I'm still a professor at the East Asian Institute, but I stepped down from my role. Alfred Schiepke is the new director. So on the work report, there's a lot to digest, frankly, and I haven't done it all yet because it was quite rich, but also quite clear. The growth target is one, and I can understand that the government is actually choosing a relatively ambitious target. They're facing quite a bit of headwinds, but the key headwind is really the expectations of people. So how do you manage the expectations of people? And they've been doing a lot in terms of promises and a lot of policies. It's sort of better for foreign investors, it's better for the private sector. But setting a clear and quite high growth target is something that simply direct expectations. So I think it's ambitious and it's going to be hard to reach, but it's also probably the right policy. Second, there's still a lot on the supply side and not that much on the demand side. So high quality growth is still the center of the speech. The new productive forces, a new term that emerged last September in the speech by Xi Jinping, has been emphasized many, many times. We still don't quite know what it is, but it is sort of more the outer edges of innovative manufacturing, I think, where China is setting up its science and technology system, where China has put the Ministry of Industry and Information in charge of translating the science and technology into new manufacturing. And that remains the mainstay of the government policy. That hasn't changed. On the demand side, well, as I think the stimulus is actually going to be very important, not for markets, not for anything, but I think the key risk for this year is deflation. And if you look at the numbers, they're starting to become of concern. Last year, overall, the GDP deflator went down with 0.6%, but the last quarter, it was already 1.6%. The producer price index is still falling. The consumer price index is barely positive. The 3% target is very, very optimistic. But again, I think it projects to some extent the government's concern about that deflationary tendencies, and so giving a different expectation going forward. But to actually deliver on that, you need to effectuate a stimulus. And I think the fiscal numbers thus far are not yet strong enough. On the monetary side, the promise is let's have finances grow in line with nominal GDP growth. That means there's not much extra stimulus coming from that side. And also it's problematic. There's not that many people want to borrow. And also the 300% of GDP debt that is currently in China is becoming a key risk. So most of it has to come from fiscal, but the fiscal machine is broken. It used to be central government telling local governments, look, we need a stimulus and here's some money and you do the rest. And the rest was then through infrastructure development, to real estate development, to land sales, and that financed the stimulus. That no longer works. And so if I compare the numbers, so they can borrow a little bit more than last year, but only 0.1 trillion, what's 100 billion between friends in China, that's not a very strong signal. Second, the transfers of central government to local government are basically the same as last year. So local governments can't do more with central government money, if you want. So I think up till now, there is not yet sufficient stimulus as presented in the budget. At the same time, they have promised to say, well, we can do more if needed. And I think that's the back door through which the stimulus in the end is going to be delivered. Basically, like last year, where it was decided in July, but announced in September, an extra 1 trillion in borrowing. The overall deficit is a bit larger. If you look at a comprehensive measure of deficit, it's about a percentage point larger than last year. But the circumstances, as Guonan said, are also more difficult. The second part of the demand side requires a lot of structural reforms. And frankly, I think this is not the year of structural reforms. I'm still waiting for the third plenum. We're going to talk about it later on. But the structural reforms that would strengthen the domestic demand, I think, are still outstanding. There's a little bit of promise for stimulating households to spend more, but they still face a lot of uncertainty. And I don't think what is in the current government report would be sufficient to turn that around. Again, we'll have to come back to government. The government has been very reluctant to have the bazooka-style stimulus. And I can understand why, because last time it happened, the first couple of years were good, and then it derailed into a lot of waste and a lot of duplication, and they don't want to see that again. That's against the high-quality growth objective. At the same time, it's only really the government, and particularly the central government, that has the debt capacity to carry a large stimulus. So, but there's lots of areas where you can invest, and the key one being a green transition, where you say, look, China has 100% of GDP, according to Tsinghua University, 100% of GDP to spend between now and 2060. Well, why not front load a bunch of that spending? So not make it 2.5% a year, but 5% a year. Then you have a great stimulus, quite related to sort of the pattern of growth, the capacity in China. Lots of construction workers can then do new energy, and that would be very helpful for the economy. The second, which is actually in the budget, is the new energy vehicles that they're going to subsidize. Again, the subsidies have basically been reduced to almost zero. They're going to put that up again. It shifts at least some demand from the future to this year, and that would be helpful. It would also be helpful for averting a key risk, and that is on the external side. Because China is doing so well on the manufacturing side, but not that well on domestic demand, the surpluses, particularly in manufacturing, are growing. And it's become a real issue in Washington and in Brussels. And frankly, it's going to be very hard to avert further policy action from the EU or the United States. So that's a key risk to growth for China. Let me stop here.
Thanks so much for that, Bert. And Jessica, let's turn to you for thoughts on the foreign policy and Taiwan part of the government work report and the two sessions.
Great, thanks. So I think on the foreign policy front, we're seeing a lot of continuity and not a lot of news being made here at the two sessions, which is not unexpected. We see a continuation on the themes of seeking stability while making progress towards various Chinese goals, modernization, self-sufficiency, particularly in technology, particularly claiming success in doing so and withstanding external pressures, even amidst internal difficulties. I think we're seeing in both the broader foreign policy, but also on Taiwan specifically, a continued emphasis on both the resolve as well as the assurance dimension, a continued invocation of peaceful development, both vis-a-vis cross-strait relations and the world, but also the resolve piece, remain, quote, firm in opposing all hegemonic, high-handed and bullying acts, as well as on the Taiwan piece of it, quote, resolutely opposing separatist activities aimed at so-called Taiwan independence and external interference, quote. So on this, I mean, I think that we can, people have been making something of whether or not the peaceful word's absence in front of reunification is significant. I think this is not the first time that's been absent. I also think that it was immediately preceded by the phrase peaceful development. And ultimately, we'll see more clarity around that. I don't think we should over-interpret what can be learned from that phrase in that sentence. More broadly, I think there's a light touch on the, again, continued themes of China's vision for the reform of global governance and the future of international order. The emphasis on a quote equally and orderly multipolar world, this sort of beneficial, inclusive economic globalization, again, remaining opposed to sort of high-handed acts, but also, again, underscoring the continuity in Xi's signature global development initiative, global security initiative, global civilization. So these are not new. These themes have been repeated over and over, and I would recommend for a deeper dive on some of these themes and their place in Chinese foreign policy and Xi Jinping's thinking. Neil's excellent conversation with Bonnie Glaser on her Global China podcast, China Global podcast at the German Marshall Fund from last December. So ultimately, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a nothing burger, but I don't think that there's very much here as expected to take away for any signs of any inflection in Chinese foreign policy. Ultimately, I think that we're seeing a fair amount of continuity and the overall emphasis on seeking stability, domestic unity as the Chinese Communist Party confronts these economic headwinds and what she has previously described as U.S.-led Western efforts to contain and block or suppress China's development. This is I think continues to be a relatively tit for tat approach, one that emphasizes resolve, but also is trying to convey to the broader majority of the world, again, a theme that we're seeing in Chinese foreign policy, to convey that again, in contrast to what the PRC has described as U.S. kind of minilateralism or unilateralism, is a China that's working with a broad swath of the majority of the world's nations to lead on the reform of global governance in a direction that better aligns with Chinese interests, but also that of many other countries in the world.
In terms of the main political watch points that have emerged in the first couple of days, the two sessions, I think there's three major things that are happening. Firstly, to what I was just discussing, there was the relationship between the president, Xi Jinping, also the general secretary of the Communist Party and head of the military, China's paramount leader, to the premier, Li Qiang. We had the cancellation this year for the first time in around 3 decades of the premier's press conference, which used to happen on the last day after all the other business was out the way. It was really one of the only chances every year for foreign journalists to interact directly with a national level leader in the Communist Party. It used to be quite a raucous and a live affair kind of 10, 15, 20 years ago when you had, old premiers like Zhu Rongji and Wen Jiabao kind of making quite direct comments about their views on economic reform. Most recently, Li Keqiang, the late predecessor to Li Qiang, made a veiled but quite pointed reference to the fact that China still has 600 million people living on around 1,000 RMB a day. He said that in 2020, right towards the conclusion of Xi Jinping's campaign to eliminate poverty. But in general, it has been a fairly anodyne affair for the last decade or so under Xi's rule. But the fact that it is ending is certainly notable as another step in the diminishing of the visibility of any other leaders apart from Xi. And I think that the economic context of weaker growth, more social malaise, it helps to ensure that there's no visible alternative to Xi's leadership, because he's obviously takes on the risk of being associated with all of the policies that are coming out. But he does seem a lot more confident in that direction than markets and many other people are, and we'll get into that issue later. The other major thing that's happening is there's going to be a revision of the State Council Organic Law, which is basically the law that determines how the State Council operates. It's being revised basically to formalize its subservience to the party and specifically to Xi Jinping thought, as well as, interestingly, some of Xi's economic policies. So one of the additions to the State Council Organic Law is that it now, by law, must help to implement Xi's new development concept, which we can again get into a bit later. Basically, entrenching the State Council's role as serving not only the Communist Party, but specifically Xi's vision for how China's policy should be developing, including on the economy. And finally, on elite politics, there was some expectation that there would be personnel appointments made at the two sessions, including potentially a new foreign minister and the promotion of that person and the new defense minister, Dong Jun, to state councillor roles, which are a half rank above ministers, and which their predecessors, Qin Gang and Li Shanfu, who were removed from their posts for various personal indiscretions and corruption investigations last year. But there was no personnel movements on the agenda, so it looks like that's not happening for the moment. Although there is, still chat in Beijing that a new foreign minister is still coming soon, but we might have to wait until the next meeting of the National People's Congress Standing Committee, which also has the power to appoint and remove ministers and state councillors, for those changes to take effect, and that will happen in late April. It could also, still be delayed. If we look at the foreign policy sphere, Wang Yi is currently the top diplomat on the Politburo, leads the party's foreign affairs office, as well as being foreign minister. So he really dominates decision-making below Xi, and he might quite enjoy being in that position to have be the main voice on advising Xi in foreign policy. So of course, there's maybe there's some lobbying going on there within the foreign affairs establishment. So that's, I think, those three things: the Premier's press conference, the State Council law, and personnel movements not happening. Kind of the major elite politics developments, and the theme that runs through them all is just a continued elevation of Xi's stature within the party. I mean, there was some talk perhaps that now Xi has a bunch of his trusted lieutenants around him, that they might be able to step up and play a more prominent role in policymaking, which, if the Premier's Li Chang, someone who's had a lot of experience working with international business, he's apparently quite good in that role. That could have had, people thought that might have a, beneficial effect on policymaking. But it seems like, Xi wants to remain very much in the spotlight and, keep his agenda going forward. And I think that's an interesting point for us to discuss a bit further, which is that, markets around the world are, losing confidence in China. There's been big drops over the last couple of years. There's been calls from economists, both within China and outside China, for a whole range of new approaches, ranging from, consumer stimulus to, investments more in social welfare to, relaxing tensions with the United States. And there's a whole host of proposals out there that people have for the direction China's economy should be going in, and a lot of concern that that's not happening. But if we look at what the government work report says, we look at what is happening in other policies in Beijing, it seems like President Xi has a very different view of the Chinese economy and is much more confident about the direction in which it's going. So I wonder if I can turn to you, Guonan, and then Bert.
I think we have been observing some noticeable discrepancy between the policy implemented by Beijing and the view reviewed by Beijing and the market discrepancy is getting more and more stark, I would say. And there could be multiple reasons for this discrepancy. One possibility, as you mentioned, is that the vision pursued by Xi Jinping could be quite focused and quite different as well from the market expectation. And my personal view would be that Xi has given much more focus on technology and much less on consumer spending, for example, and also even less on property sector. But unfortunately, property sector has been the leading growth engine for the past 2 decades. And now suddenly it becomes a big drag on the economy. And that's something probably Xi himself probably will have to handle, how to make that difficult transition. And that probably will be somewhat different from the vision Xi has been pursuing in terms of a more technological-driven direction of the economic growth in the next few years. That would be my interpretation.
All right, let me take it over. Neil, if I would understand the markets, I would be rich. I never understood the Chinese stock market and the ups and downs and the bubbles and the crashes that happened in the past. I don't quite understand them now. On the government policy side, I think on the one hand, there's a really strong package coming together which is not different from, if you want, the 2013 third plenum package, i.e. moving towards higher value production, more innovation, more productivity-driven growth. Just the means have changed, and the means have moved from making the market having the decisive role in resource allocation, as it was in 2013. That sentence is still repeated from time to time, but it's now much more a government-driven effort. And I don't quite understand why that happened, but it does mean that the market or the private sector has a bit of a hard time adjusting to that. So if you look at the plans of the government, they've identified a number of areas, a lot of areas of emphasis of new technologies and new production, and they all seem by and large fine. But the market would still have to say, okay, so here's how I can make money out of this. And that's in the end what drives stock market. And I think there's still, given the very strong presence of government, the leading roles of state enterprises in a number of areas, market participants or private sector says, well, I'm not quite sure where I can make that money. And I think that is in part reflected in the stock market. On top of that, of course, for foreign participants, you have the geopolitics. On top of that, and the foreign direct investment numbers got big headlines, the safe numbers on foreign direct investment, way down, negative in the third quarter. But that's also the macroeconomics that has completely changed. So that's not in China's hand. That is the rest of the world adjusting to a high inflation environment and fighting it. And that suddenly makes China a lot less attractive. So that happens, but that is not necessarily an enormous cause for concern. So it's I think a mixed, to some extent, a mixed bag. But I think the plan as is quite structured. We know from experience that in the past, a very involved state with lots of industrial policy plans doesn't really work that well. That's not to say that China can't succeed, but the empirical evidence is that usually more focus, targeted subsidies for research and development, for early stage knowledge building is more productive than, say, a very broad pattern of industry development. And that's what I see in China happening. The second aspect of that is that has increasingly international repercussions. Yes, the WTO is not very good in the rules on industrial policy, but there's more and more resistance because a lot of outsiders, including the EU and the United States government, says, well, this was not what we signed up for. But China entered the WTO in 2000. So I think that is I mentioned it before, I think that's a key risk that might derail some of the results that China is anticipating from its new development policy.
Thanks, Bert. And while we're on these issues of where China's economy is going, something that a lot of people again, both inside and outside China are looking for is the third plenum, which is the third plenary meeting of the Central Committee that was appointed at the 20th Party Congress in October 2022. Historically, third plenums have tended to focus on economic reforms. So there's a lot of expectation in some quarters that the next third plenum, which has to be held sometime this year, according to the party charter, is going to focus on the economy and might bring some kind of indication of new directions that the leadership is taking to respond to what has been a much more difficult than expected recovery from the COVID period. So again, just staying for the moment quickly with Guonan and then Bert, I'd just like to get your views on what do you expect to happen at the third plenum and what will be the implications for businesses and investors and policymakers who are paying attention to this?
I would anticipate two things. Probably Beijing probably will have to make a move in terms of pushing through the reform agenda, because the third plenum typically is more a medium-term focused of structural solutions. The first one probably will be that Beijing probably will have to bring up the issue of the role of the private sector before it's getting too late, and before the entire private sector is losing its confidence. They have to make some stronger commitment to the private sector and its role in the economy with reasonably stronger assurance. That's the first thing I would hope the third plenum can bring along. The second thing would be that probably Beijing may have to find a longer-term solution about the challenges of the local government debt. So far, it's a mixture of kicking the can down the road and some medium-term solution of increasing central government bonds to inject them into the local government. And longer term, there ought to be some more structural solution to this financing of the local government, especially in light of the much diminishing role of the property sector going forward. These are the two things I am looking for the third plenum.
But what about your expectations for the third plenum?
Well, Neil, I don't really have expectations, but I definitely have a wish list. And in my first Asia Society publication, I actually put that wish list together for those people who want to read some of the detail. But I agree with Guonang that actually, I think the highest priority is now fiscal reforms. The fiscal system, as is, does not deliver on equity, it does not deliver on stabilization, and it increasingly does not deliver on growth. So those are three classic functions of a fiscal system where China is now struggling. And there's a long-term plan. In the long term, China needs a lot more revenues. They've given away a lot of revenues during the past COVID crisis, but even before that. In the long term, they have lots of expenditures to be had, especially in an aging society, but more broadly in a middle-class society that expects more service from government. So they need more revenues. They need a much better central-local fiscal arrangements. And that in the short term, it is getting more money to local governments who are suffering, who have lost 1/3 of their revenues from land sales, who are over-indebted. That needs to be resolved. There can be some short-term measures there, but structurally, you need to think about a system that gives more to local governments and spreads it more equally around the country. Second, I believe that the retirement age and the pension reforms are very important for China. The potential costs are really quite large. The implicit pension debt, if you look at urban pensions, if you look at national pensions at the urban level, is really quite large, and that needs to be fixed. And pushing the retirement age to 65 for both men and women would be a long-term goal, but it would actually have to start. One need not legislate that, and Macron in France has some experience, but looking for giving the incentives for people to work much longer than they do now. The third, terribly important for efficiency of allocation of labor, is the household registration system. I believe it's very important for common prosperity. It cannot be that there's two types of citizens in China, but it's also important for efficiency so that people can move wherever they are most productive. A fourth, and that is related to the hukou system, a social safety net for migrants. Every time there is a downturn in China's economy, the flexibility lies in the migrant labor force. They get, if you want, fired and sent back to their village, but it really means immediately a dip in demand. You can actually prevent that by providing much better social safety also for migrants. Finally, enterprise reforms. This is actually a really good time to think about that. The reason is that a lot of local governments have enormous amounts of assets. And yes, some of those are strategic, some of those state enterprises are in strategic sectors, and by all means, the government should continue to run them because that's their objective. But there's many areas where you say, really, should the government have that? Take Guizhou, that's my poster child. Now, Guizhou is deep in debt, but they also have the most valuable Baijiu company in the world that has a valuation that is 400 billion, 500 billion, I forgot now what it is today. But so wouldn't you want to use some of those assets? So non-core, not strategic, for actually resolving some of the debt issues. And it would, in the longer term, bring much higher efficiency, because governments shouldn't run transport companies, they shouldn't run hotels, they probably shouldn't run Baijiu alcohol companies and cigarette companies. So there's a lot of efficiency gains to be had without touching on the strategic importance of state enterprises. Thanks.
Thanks, Bert and Gordon. I think that is an important point, that in China's economy might not be looking super good at the moment, but there is still a lot of potential to turn that round with the right package of policies and structural reforms. There's obviously a key political question about whether the top leadership is getting in the way of those types of agendas for various ideological and political reasons. And I feel that my own thoughts about the third plenum are that people expecting a big package of market-oriented reforms, or a kind of wish list of everything that they want, are probably going to be quite disappointed. But there has been an uptick in language, like we saw ahead of the 2013 third plenum, about the need to further comprehensively deepen reforms, which is the theme of the third plenum from 2013. So there is a suggestion out there that perhaps the third plenum will focus on these economic structural reform issues, but all the signals that are currently coming from Beijing seem to suggest that will be reform on Xi's terms in this kind of current mode of high quality development focused on investment, technology, innovation, and less focused on consumption and some of these central local fiscal reforms. But the options are there, and I think if things do get bad enough, then those steps become much more on the table. But I do want to focus on the kind of international and foreign policy implications of this, because there's always the foreign policy is domestic policy is foreign policy. So and this is taking a few questions as well from the Q&A. I want to turn to you, Jessica, and just ask, what is the effect, do you think, of China's current economic wobbles on Chinese foreign policy? I mean, is there a relationship between the strength of China's economy and the assertiveness of its foreign policy on issues like Taiwan, the South China Sea, US-China relations? There's a lot of hotspots. Got some questions about whether Xi's ongoing rule is leading towards him wanting to take moves on Taiwan. Thank you to Tom Watkins. Camilla Sorensen also asks what kind of change in language on Taiwan we would expect if there was a real change in policy there. Is there signs from the two sessions? This is a question from Walker at VOA. In granting a lot more journalism visas, that there's a focus on openness and stability this year. So just love, Jessica, if you could just link the economic situation domestically to China's international relations and kind of help us to understand how those two things will interplay with each other this year and beyond.
I certainly think that there's a relationship, but it doesn't necessarily run in the direction that there has been some speculation that these troubles at home might lead to more aggression abroad. I think what we are seeing is very much a concerted effort, and to some extent at the expense of with willingness to take more risks to address some of these structural challenges, is a desire to batten down the hatches, to prevent potential sources of vulnerability or exploitation in the anticipation of some potential conflict, not one that China would necessarily start, but might need to react to. I think they're looking closely at what the new president-elect in Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, will say in his inauguration and later this year on National Day. These are questions, again, I don't see any evidence so far of a much more forward-leaning, risk-accepting approach from Xi Jinping and the top leadership, but there is certainly a preparation for the potential intensification of external challenges and tensions, not only vis-a-vis Taiwan, but what a potential future U.S. president might try to do, whether it's on the economic front with across-the-board tariffs or in vis-a-vis Taiwan or the South China Sea. I think what we're seeing so far is, at least from the Chinese perspective, a continued effort to calibrate the escalation or counter-escalation in their perception against moves, whether it's by the Philippines and the South China Sea or against what they call Taiwan independence forces on Taiwan. Again, we're leaving a lot in reserve, future measures that could be taken to dial up the pressure if they feel that additional weight is needed in the effort to deter further moves. But this is, as I said, I think very much an approach that will be very sensitive to potential provocations, slights, efforts to strangle China and its ambitions to modernize and become a great technological leading power. But it's also not one that I think is going to go hard at those objectives through much more destabilizing measures, not with the intent to destabilize again, but that then leaves, I think, a much less room for those domestically in China who want to pursue measures that could go very badly. There's going to be some major upsides, but also potential downsides. And I think that as the top leadership looks out at the potential turbulence in the world, they're looking for sources of insurance as well as leverage. And that's where I think the Global South plays an important role, as well as China will, I expect to see continued outreach and efforts to work around the world to provide ballast and legitimacy for the top leadership as it confronts increasingly tense, well, not necessarily only increasingly tense, but potentially increasingly tense relations with the developed West. Although I guess with a caveat that I think that the efforts to stabilize the U.S.-China relationship have, I think, had significant traction. And I think that we're seeing signs of at least an agreement to disagree in some areas, but also efforts to work together in areas where the two sides do have shared interests, including on counter-narcotics and the beginning of some of these resumed channels of diplomatic engagement. I think certainly are an important step there. And so I don't want to discount that as an important part of the overall foreign policy picture as China's leaders look out toward the world.
Thanks, Jessica. Any quick thoughts on that specific question that I rattled through quite quickly before on what would you be looking for to show a change in China's assessments regarding Taiwan? Would it be a change in language? Would it be in a government work report? I think that's an interesting question because obviously Taiwan's is a huge focus. Everyone has been looking at different things. Some people think there'll be an invasion in a couple of years. Some people say that will never happen. What would actually be evidence to you that there is a change in assessment, which obviously would have a huge effect on China's economy, markets around the world? So I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are there.
Indeed, I think that I wouldn't expect it to be in the work report, but the kinds of language or shifts that I think would signal a potential departure or a rapid acceleration of change in policy trajectory would be sort of the abandonment of language around peaceful development. There would be, instead of the language that we have heard from Xi Jinping himself around, the wheels of history are moving on toward reunification, the time is on China's side. If instead we saw the opposite, just the time is running out, if things are going downhill quickly, if that judgment were to change and be then telegraphed, first of all, you could have the judgment change and it wouldn't be telegraphed. But if it's changed and it's telegraphed, I think that as well as the standard language now around not just these countries or leaders are playing with fire. There's a whole kind of ladder of rhetoric and escalatory signaling that the government and the party have used. Of course, they can draw upon the new and innovate there. And I think the bloodier the language, the more intense the color there around threats. I think those would all be certainly ones that I think that foreigners and markets would pay a lot of attention to. I just don't see that here.
Thanks, Jessica. That's super valuable. And hopefully we can all get better at identifying what the real signal is compared to the noise. Got an interesting question on the Q&A that another question that links the international to the domestic, but turning back towards the economy, and so to Guonan and to Bert. So Carsten Ramsdale at Weber Shandwick asks, how do you understand the continued emphasis on boosting self-sufficiency or self-reliance in China's economic policy with simultaneously a pretty tepid demand side stimulus? So we got focus on self-sufficiency, but also pretty low focus on actually, disappointing policies on actually stimulating domestic demand and building that internal market. So why is there that disconnect? Is it just a hard to break habit? Is it just that the supply side is more politically important? Does it relate to policies towards the global south and the BRI? How do you explain that disconnect between self-reliance, but a pretty weak focus on boosting domestic demand?
It's a really interesting contradiction there, a remaining contradiction, because China has done really well, if you define it in China's terms, in becoming self-reliant. If you look at all the major economies in the world, China has the highest level of domestic value added in its export package. China also has become much more important for other countries in their export package because they have moved up the value chain, much more intermediary. So if you want, other countries rely more on China, even the United States. Other countries even more, but the United States also has increasingly more relied on China's inputs into its manufacturing. So if you want, the half of the dual circulation has been achieved. The self-reliance on the supply side has been achieved. And yet China's growth is quite vulnerable to demand from abroad. And we see it now with rising tensions. Also, China, I think, hasn't fully yet digested that Xi Jinping keeps on saying it's a big country, but it is also a much bigger country than 15 years ago when we had the global financial crisis and when China's surpluses were an issue, but not the issue. Now, if China has a 2% of GDP surplus on the current account, that means much more than the current account surplus of 2007 in terms of global GDP, because China is not so big. Same with manufacturers. That has been even though the surplus in China's term, well, they're about 1% of GDP, but in global terms, they're much bigger than before. So China really weighs very heavily on that economy. And to some extent, you would say, well, there is even for self-preservation and to avoid trade actions, that domestic demand should be higher up the agenda than it currently is. Thanks.
Yes, I think Bert made a very interesting and useful point there. And I think China used to be, over the past few decades, has been moving away from self-reliance. You can tell it's willing to rely on overseas market. It's willing to rely much more on the international energy market. It's more than happy to do so. So where does this self-reliance come from? Is it from Xi Jinping himself alone? Or Beijing probably feel that they have no choice? Now, the two sources of self-reliance is there, which has been coming into fashion. One is that the overseas market has been restricted to some extent through tariff. And the second is that technology-wise, access to technology is increasingly becoming less and less convenient, to put it mildly. So Beijing probably feel that they have to rely on something on their own in terms of, for example, some of the crucial technology, and also has to rely less on the overseas market, at least the traditional overseas market, so that they try to boost domestic market, the domestic demand. But whether this will be a good way to do so, I have some doubt myself. I think probably China still would do its best to try to not too much self-reliance and try to seek access to overseas market and as well as overseas technology. But unless Beijing feel that they have no choice, they have to cut down that part.
Thanks, Guonan. We're running close to the hour now, so let's maybe do a final lightning round of all the panelists focused on different dimensions of technology, which has been a big theme of some of the questions that have been coming in over the Q&A from many people. So we've got some questions about, what do the new productive forces mean? What sectors is that going to have an impact on? And what does that mean for investors and for businesses in China? And also, what is the chance that an economic strategy focused so much on technology is going to be successful? Is this going to be sufficient as a new growth driver for China? It seems to be very central to Xi's policies. So maybe Guonan and Bert, you can tackle that. And then Jessica, this question about whether the technological development of China is kind of part of strategy towards Taiwan. And is there any kind of relationship between reaching a certain point technologically and then being more prepared to use the military for aggressive purposes outside of China's border? And I guess really about military modernization and whether there's a strong connection between technology domestically in economic strategy and foreign policy. So how about we go Guonan, then Bert, then Jessica, and then I'll wrap up.
Thank you, Neil. I think going forward, one principal source of demand in China probably will be diminishing over time, and that is the housing market. And so Beijing will have to somehow find a way to do so. And those more technologically oriented sector may be one answer, and also the renewable energy. But even on these fronts, it's not Beijing's pure wish to increase self-reliance, but Beijing probably will have no choice but to become more self-reliant. That's my take. Thank you.
All right. Well, without going into the weeds, if you really want to know what China's working on, do two things. Read the 14 5-year plan. It's a ripping read, I can tell you. And that's the current sector of focus. They're quite explicit about it. They're not that different from Made in China 2025, but that's sort of ongoing. Then there is an NDRC document of last fall, which has sort of the future industries in it. That's more speculative. That's down the road. That's where currently the investments in science and technology are happening. So if you want to be on the China trail, if you want, those are the areas that you would want to focus on. Now, is it enough? Neil, no, I don't think it's enough. And let me, again, I was working a little bit on numbers. Let me give you one striking number. There's a fantastically successful automobile industry right now in China. They're exporting, they're going to be the biggest exporter in the world. They have 4.5 million people working in the automobile sector. Now, there's lots of knock-on sectors as well, but this is sort of the core automobile sector. That's not different from 10 years ago. It's exactly the same number. So modern manufacturing, that is much of the mainstay of what China is looking at, it doesn't produce jobs. It doesn't produce the jobs that it takes. And so there's lots of other sectors, and particularly services, that usually give the jobs. And that was very true before COVID. After COVID, that's no longer the case. So it needs to have a broader context. And to have services thrive, you need to have that domestic demand, because they're largely domestically supplied. So you can't do without that domestic demand. So again, it's another reason. Employment is another reason to think very hard about that domestic demand, which will translate into a much larger services sector, perfectly natural. For China's level of income, the service sector is still quite below what you would expect. And over time, it can be a source of income. It can help actually manufacturing become more productive, and it's a big source of employment. Thanks.
Perhaps I'll just follow up by suggesting that someone watching China's economic troubles and wondering whether or not this is good for the world or not. And I think particularly on the question around how much will challenges or obstruction to China's technological modernization pose some threat to the greater risk of aggression vis-a-vis Taiwan. I mean, I tend not to think of them as being directly linked. There's no easy attack on Taiwan that would somehow solve the party's legitimacy challenges. This is a great, big, and potentially disastrous gamble that would, of course, undo many of the efforts that the country has made to grow and develop and face enormous isolation after such a catastrophic gamble. But at the same time, I do think that there is a risk that if Xi Jinping's judgment that these technology suppression measures will fail, that China will indeed succeed. Maybe there be a lot of waste, but nonetheless that they will be able to succeed despite them in modernizing and becoming a technological superpower. That if that judgment should change and the future looks very bleak, I do think that there is some risk that we should not ignore that to preserve the party's legitimacy, they look for other means, and that to see that path obstructed is something that we should be concerned about and take into account as we think about the relationship between China's economic and security objectives and what foreign actors might do to both hedge against the worst, but also prepare for a future where the peace and stability in the Western Pacific remains.
Fantastic. Thank you. We are now running over time, unfortunately, so I'll have to bring this event to a close. A recording will be available tomorrow on the Asia Society website, and the Center for China Analysis will also be publishing a review article of the two sessions after it wraps up next week. So to conclude, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Guonan Ma, to Bert Hoffman, and to Jessica Chen Weiss for making the time to join us, for sharing their insights. A huge thank you too to the whole CCA team behind the scenes and Asia Society who made this happen. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us and for asking some really great questions. And look forward to staying in touch and continuing the conversation. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.